And we are ready for Ben to take it away.
All right. Well, I just wanted to take an opportunity today, and we'll talk a little bit about large fires and how we get to large fires, why we need more large fires, where we're at, kind of in the whole situation of controlled burns here in Nebraska, the way things are at right now. And so when I refer to large controlled burns, I'm usually thinking pretty big, so in excess of 500 acres. 500 acres at a pop. This photo right here will come up a little bit later. This was back in, I think, 2011 that we did this fire, and there's a couple different fires there and things to talk about. So to provide a little bit of background, where I work is right in the middle of the state. If you were to look at the legacy plan and look at the Central Luss Hills, it looks like someone spilled their coffee on a map of Nebraska. But the larger Central Luss Hills ecoregion is 2.3 million acres of mixed grass prairie. There's other ag ground in there as well. It's basically the size of Yellowstone. From a fire standpoint, if you were to look at what our fire return interval, and you can get a little bit too wrapped up in fire return intervals, but just for the sake of this presentation, we probably have about an 8-year fire return interval in our area in the middle of the state there. And then on top of that, for a little more background, among those 2.3 million acres of mixed grass prairie, we're about 11% invaded by eastern red cedar. And that is actually a couple years old too. So it's probably been growing a little bit since then as well. From a fire standpoint, Pheasants Forever has helped to form prescribed burn associations all over the state. We have them from east to west. To date, right now, ever since the first burn association did their first fire back in 2008, we've had 813 fires, which is a good number, covering 49,000 acres, which is another good number. When we look at that, it's about 61 acres per fire statewide. In the Luss Hills, we have a couple burn associations there. We bump up a little bit there where we're averaging about 115 acres per fire. And so it's a little bit better. When I look at the area that we have, if we have a goal of continuing to grow fire, and let's say we think really big and say we'd like to see all of those acres under a fire system at a historical fire interval, and we do that at 115 acres per fire on average, that's looking at 200 or 2,500 fires annually. And if you think of the capacity and the logistics behind that, that's a lot. And so one of the things that we're looking at is, well, if you either have more fires or bigger fires, which one do we want to focus on? And we're really looking at delivering bigger fires there. Jen just talked about the Niobrara Treks. We do have the Loop River Treks in the Central Luss Hills there as well that we've been doing since 2010. And really the big focus that we have there is delivering ecologically at scale fires. So in excess of from about 4,000 to 6,000 acres is what we typically target. So we'll talk a little bit about why would you want to do large controlled burns. So one of them is just time economy. So when you think about those 115 acre burns, the logistics around conducting a burn like that, you're getting your neighbors, you're getting your family together for a whole day, right? It's 115 acres. Well, when we do a 500 acre fire, you're getting everybody together for a whole day as well. Typically in a large controlled burn, you have safer burn unit boundaries. So instead of burning right on a property boundary, where sometimes if you've walked those fence lines, sometimes those fences go through some pretty steep or some pretty heavily forested areas. If we back those lines up even farther onto the neighbor's ground, we can get into a safer burn unit boundary. We can get a little bit farther away from hazardous areas, and then there's some other things as well that we'll get into. So like we said, you're pretty well committed for an entire day when you go on one of these fires. right? And so you have these neighbors, you have other family, you have hired hands that have canceled your plans for an entire day for that 61 or for that 115 acre fire. With those 500 acre fires, we're doing the same thing. Again, we talked about safe burn unit boundaries. There it is. So this is a property line in my area. And you can see over here the fence line that divides landowner A over here from landowner B. This doesn't look like an area where you would want to have a control line for a fire. So if we back this up, the guy on the landowner B wants to do a fire. If we back it up over on landowner's A's land, a couple hundred yards, you're increasing the size of your fire. You're getting a little bit more cedar control in there, and also you're providing a safer avenue for your crew members in there. Here's another example. How would you put a line through there? It'd be very, very difficult. So let's expand. Let's go around and then not just avoid that, but let's have this be a part of our fire and a part of our treatment as well. We can get a little bit farther away from those hazardous areas. And so if you look at this, if this is right on your line, you're going to be hard at work that day. You're going to be chasing some spot fires, and although that can be fun, it can be awful exhausting as well, doing that for a whole day. So expanding our unit lines from these areas, keeping these more interior, we're just growing the size of our fire. And then looking at servicing multiple landowners and their families and helping them out in very, very meaningful ways, and building a sense of community throughout these rural neighborhoods. It's becoming, in private lands conservation, more of a term that we talk about, cross-boundary cooperation. So cross-boundary meaning working across fences. So we're working with our landowners, and we're sharing our vision of our conservation goals, or even our operational goals. I don't know too many landowners in our area who want cedar trees out in their pasture, and their neighbors don't want them either. And those cedar trees certainly don't respect property boundaries. So there are some ecological benefits, and I'm going to talk about some of these right now, and then we'll get into some of those a little bit more a little bit later. But these large fires are representative to a certain degree of historic fires that would go through and keep burning until the next creek or river or some unfueled area. Also, we're providing more space for area-sensitive grassland species, especially area-sensitive and species that have vertical sensitivities to vertical structures and vertical features like trees. Again, we talked about eastern red cedar not respecting property boundaries. They'll hop right over a fence wherever the bird takes them. Some cool season grasses, especially those rhizomatous cool season grasses that can spread over a large area, and then offering refugia for sensitive wildlife that we're targeting. When we're looking at large fires, there are some special considerations that we have to think about that we generally don't have to worry about with smaller fires. One of them is time economy. So you think about daylight time. If we're doing a large fire, it's going to take a lot of time. And in some areas of the state, the beginning of March and sometimes earlier is the beginning of our fire season. You got to think about, well, how long of a day do you have at the beginning of March? It's a lot shorter than it will be at the end of April. And so you have that certain time of day, not just when the sun comes up and the sun goes down, but when your fuels become available for fire, when that dew picks up. It does have an effect on fire behavior. You know, those times of day. A lot of you have seen the charts, how humidity impacts with temperature, and how you get that kind of that critical area during the middle of the day. Well, when those days are really short, that critical area is where you get that fire behavior that sometimes you fear and sometimes you really want if you have some trees in the interior of your unit. And so that time economy that you're dealing with on shorter days, just making sure you're maximizing that. Also, when you have a larger fire that takes a long time, that takes all day, You lose a little bit of credibility in your briefing where you're talking about, well, this is what we expect, this is what we forecast throughout the day. The longer that fire goes, the less that becomes true and the more that you have to kind of adapt to things. Our forecasters, as good as they are with weather, can tell you with a lot more certainty what's going to happen in 10 minutes from now than they can in 10 hours from now. When we have large fires, we just have a lot more line out there. So a lot more scouting of fire breaks and accessory lines. You do deal with crew fatigue, being out there all day. You have more area to patrol. If you have 9 linear miles of line, that's 9 linear miles where something can escape. And that's not an insurmountable barrier, but something to think about. More area to mop up. You'll likely need more water refill stations if you're using wet lines, more refueling sites for torches, and maybe engines and pumps as well. And then another thing to think about would be contingency lines and other accessory lines. So if you look here, we've got this Montana unit here. In these grassland areas, there's a lot of 2-tracks that go through there, and we can use these to, and they may not be a formal fire line, but we can use these to cut off if we're not getting the fire effects we want, for good or for bad. Maybe we're just not getting the mortality we want. So if we're burning this piece and it's moving down, well, we don't want to commit to a whole day of not having as much mortality. We can cut it off here and let's burn the rest later. Or maybe things are getting a little bit too dry, too spotty. We're chasing a lot of fire outside of our line. Let's cut it off here and let's come back on a little bit more stable day to work out the rest of that. Big fires, we typically need a lot of crew members. When you're in a large fire area, you also got to think about, can my radio reach across to the other side of the unit to figure out where they're at or what they're doing? And large fires just put up a lot of smoke. Burning a lot of fuel in the middle of there. You got highways, you may have utility lines in there, other smoke sensitive features, but you just have a lot of things that can be going on in there. So I want to talk a little bit more about grab my time there, I think I'm still doing okay, about some ecological features. And we did talk about area sensitive species. And a lot of time I've heard from people before, very conservation minded people before, about, man, are you really sure you want to burn 4,000 to 6,000 acres at a pop? What are we doing for maybe, there may be some obvious positive impacts for some species, but what about other species in there as well that that fire could pose some issues to, or maybe that we just don't know how they will react to those. One of the species that we're focused on in the Central Loess Hills, as well as many other places in Nebraska, is our prairie chickens. They're area sensitive species. It's typically a 20,000 acre bird that we're thinking about. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they can serve as an umbrella for some of these other species out there when we're conducting large fires. So let's take a look at this Rubik's Cube here, just conceptually, and imagine this as 9 individual pastures, each 100 acres. So you have 900 acres here of a large fire. We never have it where it lies out in a perfect Jeffersonian grid like this, but let's just go into make-believe land here for a little bit. So each of these is 100 acres, right? And they're each owned by a different landowner, and each landowner has different things going on and different operational goals and objectives and things that they're doing. So if we look at these pastures, some of them may be similar, some of them may be different. If we look at our season of grazing, right, what season that these pastures will be grazed, some may be on a rotation and they may be grazed early, some may be grazed late, some of them may be grazed all season long, some of them may be deferred. Some people like to rest their grass completely for a year. This is definitely going to have impacts on your fuel out there, especially your fine dead fuels, right? So not only that, but let's also take a look at the grazing pressure and how heavy these guys are grazing. So you have this guy is grazing pretty heavy at 5 acres a pair. Quite a bit lighter here at 9 acres a pair. Again, you have these areas that aren't deferred, right? And everything in the middle. So if we look at those things together and think about, well, what kind of impacts are these going to have together on our fuel loading, both season and pressure of grazing? It's going to have an impact. And you can just kind of conceptualize just by looking at that, what that might look like. And so I color coded it where in the red, you're going to have areas that probably experience quite a bit more, at least on your fine dead fuels, and maybe your eastern red cedars, more fire behavior, severity, and intensity. And as you get to green, it's going to be lower fire behavior, intensity, and severity. So all of a sudden, you can look here at this large fire. You have in 100-acre blocks, you have this mosaic of fire behavior characteristics out there and fire effects that you can see. This has a big impact on things that certainly on things that you want to burn. So you need to have pretty sober expectations on what your tree mortality might be up here compared to down here. But you can also expect up here that if you have fire sensitive wildlife that you're concerned about, these are going to be more refugia areas for those. So anything like pollinators that may have eggs that haven't emerged yet or things like that. And in some areas, you're going to have, even on a micro climate scale, you're going to have something like this that emerges up. And you can see that there are areas that didn't burn in there, and you'll have some of that in there as well. You know, you look at the microclimate effects also of windmill sites or valleys and pastures that green up a little bit earlier, and the fire might not want to creep across there. In our large fires, I become much less concerned about, let's make sure we burn everything, and I get kind of excited about these more mosaic areas.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Another idea that I like to throw across is the idea of fire complexes, so building from previous burn units. I believe it adds more safety and time efficiency. So if we look at this was burned in one of our Trex events a couple years ago. These are separate burn units, and a fire complex is something that can be kind of an idea for a fire that can be burned throughout a season, not just on a specific day. So on one day you may burn this, another day you may burn this unit, another day you may burn this unit, and all of a sudden you have an enormous catcher's mitt of black down here where we can burn this unit right into, right? And we can burn this on with a little bit more extreme conditions where we can get more, expect a higher mortality on our trees in there. And then finish that one off. And that's what happened with this one. We saw this picture at the beginning, and this one was burned. This one was burned a little bit before it, but you can see these smaller areas that were burned even earlier that are already starting to green up down here and down here as well, where this was just starting to green up. And you can see this is just a photo of one that's being burned kind of in the middle where we have this unit being pushed into this unit. Oops, sorry. So that's kind of the goal of those large fires. So even though it does provide some challenges, there's certainly a lot of opportunity, hopefully, where we can begin meeting some of those goals of more fire growth out there at a more meaningful scale, and getting ahead of what the Nebraska Forest Service says we lose about somewhere around 38 to 40,000 acres a year to close canopy cedar forests. So hopefully by doing this, we can do a little bit more than that 115 acres at a pop. That's what I had, Cody. I'm happy to take any questions.